So, Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri. And Claire, of course, we have to ask you the most important question first. What about these off-season pickups by the St. Louis Cardinals? It's going to be a very, very good year for the Cards.
Goldie, huh? We're excited.
Yeah.
It's great. And, of course, in Missouri, we're also very excited right now about the Chiefs. We've got Patrick Mahomes playing sandlot football with an incredible amount of excitement. So tonight's a big game for the Chiefs. So sports are great in my state.
All right. Well, so let's talk about the election. Let's talk about the lessons that you learned during that election. And let's talk about the state of the Democratic Party right now, specifically for heartland Democrats, because Democrats can win the presidency and they can win the House, but they're still going to have trouble getting the judges they want in if they can't win Senate seats in the heart of America.
There's no question that Donald Trump ruled in Missouri and ruled in Indiana. The Republican Party is now Donald Trump's party. I believe that pendulum will swing back. I am optimistic that Democrats will win again in the Midwest and in my state. But the spectacle around the Kavanaugh confirmations, the leveraging of the caravan optics, and the fact that the president, probably directed by Mitch McConnell, figured out that he needed to camp out in Indiana and Missouri in order to boost the enthusiasm on their side of the ledger. He was there so often, Joe, I figured he had to be building a golf course because he usually only goes someplace that often if there's one of his golf courses. But it is no question that we saw a bump up in enthusiasm on their side because of his constant presence and because of the other two things I mentioned. And in a state like Missouri, it's all about who shows up to vote.
Well, let's talk about Kavanaugh specifically and how we were saying on set in real time the mishandling of the Kavanaugh case could cost Democrats like you and Donnelly and others. How devastating was that to your campaign?
Well, we had record turnout of Democrats in Missouri. Don't let anybody feed you some line that the problem was I spent too much time in rural Missouri or Democrats weren't excited. We saw an unbelievable enthusiasm of both independent voters and Democrats in urban and suburban areas and even in rural areas. But up until the Kavanaugh stuff, we really weren't seeing that enthusiasm on the Republican side. There was a double-digit difference in enthusiasm between the blue side and the red side of the equation in our state until Kavanaugh. And then it popped up. And frankly, popped up even slightly higher than our level of enthusiasm. So what that whole spectacle did was get a whole lot of people off the couch, and that really made the difference.
So let's talk about 2020 for a moment. A lot of people talking about running in 2020. And I'm just wondering, as someone that has been campaigning over the past, decade in a state that Bill Clinton won, that Jimmy Carter won, that used to be a swing state, Missouri, what type of Democrat needs to get nominated? Can, for instance, Bernie Sanders win in Missouri? Can Kamala Harris win in Missouri? Can Elizabeth Warren win in Missouri? Can they make it competitive?
I'm not sure about that. I do think that what, as a party, we need to do is make sure that we are nominating someone who is inspirational and who can convince the American people that they can make things change. And it's very hard to make things change if you're hanging out at the ends of the spectrum, if you're on opposite sides of the room and saying things that will never get 60 votes in the Senate. So I think what I hope is there's some authenticity with a candidate who will convince independent voters in my state and other states like mine that they have an equation where they can bring people together, where they can kind of repair some of the damage that has been done in terms of tribal polarization in this country. I think that's what most Americans want right now, and I think that will be the winning combination for president.
Claire, nobody really knows the percentage percentage of Trump loyalists in terms of voters per se, whether it's 32%, 25%, we don't know that. But we do know that there are an awful lot of really good, solid, substantial American citizens who do support him for whatever reason. And they're getting short-sheeted by him in terms of his performance. You gave an interview the other day in which you were talking about what some of the Republican senators say about Donald Trump behind his back. Now, I'm not going to ask you to name the senators, obviously, but in terms of the lockstep, which was the march on the Republican side of the Senate, all professing loyalty to Trump, what are some of the adjectives these senators do use to describe him behind his back and in the cloakroom?
Nuts, weak, doesn't really understand government, doesn't care to understand anything complicated, asks and says the most unbelievable things in meetings that clearly shows he doesn't understand the subject matter, no intellectual curiosity.
Dangerous? Do they say?
I don't know that I've heard dangerous, but I will say this. I believe history will judge down the line those members of the Republican Party who have silently looked down and think they can just wait this out without even speaking up about the level of lying that goes on. I mean, think about this. The president this morning tweeted, "There's nothing wrong with paying off a porn star that you had an affair with in order to win the presidency right before the election." That's what he basically said. I mean, that's crazy. So I really think there are a lot of my colleagues who feel trapped by the political reality of Donald Trump. And I think if more information comes out, and nobody can argue that Mueller hasn't done a good job not leaking, being professional, I think as this thing continues to move forward, I am really hopeful that more of my colleagues, the ones that aren't retiring, will finally speak out and say, no, this is not a process crime, Lindsay. This is something that's much bigger than that.
Much bigger than that, and of course add, Claire, to the fact that he paid off a porn star right before the election to win the election, and then went to great lengths to hide it, not only from the American people, but also from the Federal Elections Commission. That is, of course, illegal. It is a felony. And let's go to Susan Page. She has a question for you. Susan.
You know, Senator, I'd like to go back to something you said just a moment ago about the direction of the Democratic Party and the battle for the 2020 presidential nomination, because it seems to me you were raising a cautionary note to those Democrats who argue the energy is on the left, that the recipe, the path for Democrats to regain the White House does not run through states like Missouri, that those are not the places that Democrats should be focused on contesting. Are you concerned that the party is going to not learn the old lesson, the historic lesson about trying to appeal to swing voters in the middle, because there is so much excitement by some of the new voices in the party that won with a really progressive message and coalitions that did not depend so much on centrist voters?
I think a presidential candidate who shows they have some pragmatism about being able to get things done. That's how you get change. You don't get change by rhetoric. You don't get change by saying, you know, we should have free college. You get change by actually bringing people together and accomplishing something. So I'm hopeful that, and by the way, the math is unforgiving, Susan. It is very difficult to get to the presidency without winning a state like Florida. And it is very difficult to get to the presidency without winning states like Ohio. While Sherrod Brown won in Ohio, it was not a good cycle in Ohio. It was obviously a terrible cycle in Florida. So if this is just about a progressive uprising, we wouldn't have lost as many seats in the Senate, and we would have done even better in terms of the House. So Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, you can't get there without those states. So appealing to independent voters in those states is absolutely critical. And you can do that with progressive ideals as long as you don't fall off the left side of the earth.
Senator Claire McCaskill will stay with us. The entire panel will stay with us as well, and we'll have more questions in just a minute.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.